my pleasure to moderate this panel today. I'll be also making sure that we stay on track with timing. We've started a bit late, and I believe at 5 p.m. there is the next session starting without any real break or transition, so we'll have to really wrap up by 5. Yeah, hopefully we don't have to cut too much on the discussion part that we'll have at the end. Let me just introduce the purpose of this session. I think there is no additional need to really state the obvious. Randomized evaluations are needed in some case to really evaluate the impact of programs even in humanitarian settings. I think Dean Carlan this morning built that case, and during this session today we don't want to debate so much probably about the reason why we should have randomized evaluations even in humanitarian settings, but probably rather assume that in some cases it makes sense. And once we have this that is assumed and all set, we would want to look with you into the challenges of how actually designing and implementing randomized evaluations in these settings. We are here to essentially recognize the challenges, the obstacles, and the constraints that we face into thinking of designing and implementing research evaluations in these settings. We will keep referring to humanitarian settings or fragile context. I think we're probably all comfortable with those rather vague definitions of fragility and humanitarian settings, thinking that the kind of constraints and barriers we face, be it on the implementation side, on the design side, on the ethical side, are somewhat similar in those contexts. So to help us in this mission, to make sure that you get away out of this session with clear ways forward on how to mitigate some of the risks, concerns, and again, challenges in this field, we'll start with a short intro on randomized evaluation that is really just to set the stage and to make sure we're all on the same page, to make sure we talk about the same thing when we talk about measuring and defining impact. And we'll then directly turn to you, the audience, to crowdsource the key challenges you faced in implementing randomized evaluations in your programs, in your organizations, in your context. And after that, we'll have a short presentation by my colleague at JPAL Europe, Sarah Milner, that will present some of the toolkit we developed at JPAL on how to, again, mitigate the risks and challenges in running randomized evaluations in this context. We'll then go into hearing from practitioners, and we have with us today Felipe Dunch from WFP, who will tell us about randomized evaluations in Nepal, anticipatory action. We'll also have Hila Alam from Uplift Afghanistan that will tell us about their experiences and their journey in implementing randomized evaluations in this difficult context. And we also have Miguel Almanzar, who will tell us about the experience of UNICEF and the Aspect project. Without further ado, I'll hand over to my colleague Sarah for a short intro on randomized evaluations.
How we're talking about it today, so evidence could be viewed as data, interviews, surveys, administrative, KPIs even. And we can even think about this in terms of monitoring and descriptive and qualitative and quasi-experimental evidence in terms of how we generate it. But we're really going to focus on today experimental studies and specifically randomized evaluations, which we'll talk about further. When we talk about impact, there's a lot of ways that we can think about measuring impact. Numbers of participants reached, the amount spent on a budget, for example. But today we're really going to understand the causal effect on X and Y. So when we think about, how do we measure impact, I'm going to show, one of the diagrams that we'll show you today, and this will probably be the only one, depending on what the others have prepared. But we're really thinking about essentially how to measure impact, and we see here on the y-axis, so the primary outcome here, we can think of potentially What could we think of as a primary outcome? Maybe I can get an example from the audience. What would you say your primary income is, or outcome is? Maybe we think about income. And then over time, so income over time, we're thinking about it there. And we see that a program starts. So we have the income, which is decreasing over time, and you see that at the start of a program, you actually see an amazing kind of success story. So this program is clearly increasing income. Maybe it's some of the VSLAs that we've seen earlier today, spoken about in the gender working group, or some other program that has really positive impacts. And some people would evaluate this impact and understand this impact in understanding pre and post. So you would evaluate before the intervention, and you would evaluate after the intervention. And so our question would be, is this an accurate, measurement or description of impact? And so what we would really be asking ourselves is, what would have happened if the program wasn't there? What would happen if we were to measure essentially, what happened in the case where someone did not receive the program? So this is what we're understanding as the counterfactual. So this is understanding of what happens if we were to not receive the program, and this is how we really measure impact. So the impact of a program, as we define it, is defined as a comparison between what actually happens after the program has been introduced and what would have happened, so had the program not been introduced. And we understand this as this great problem that we're trying to deal with. And this is perhaps something you've heard about a lot before, and just a repetition, but useful to all be on the same page. But this real problem with not being able to understand essentially the state of the world, of the world that the program participants would have experienced if they had the absence of the program. So this is what we're continuously trying to create, and as a solution to this problem, we need to essentially mimic or construct the counterfactual. And we do that by randomization. And so we can really understand the difference between treatment and control group, and understand this impact between both of them by using randomized evaluations. And so this is something where you have an intervention and you randomize assignment at the intervention stage, and then measure outcomes afterwards. So we'll quickly go into a bit of brainstorming after this about some of the challenges related to randomizations, but first let's discuss why would we randomize and in which cases we would randomize. So randomization is useful, if the program is ready for an evaluation. It's quite useful if there is really an element that can be randomized, and this is something that if the program has already been rolled out and you're not expanding elsewhere, or randomization might not necessarily be feasible or ethical. But if you're thinking of scaling a project, or you're thinking of understanding the effects of a pilot, that's a great moment to randomize and understand this larger impact. So this goes back to the point of if there's genuine uncertainty about effectiveness, and if there's genuine uncertainty about cost effectiveness, that's when we want to aim to randomize. And so the last point that we ask ourselves is whether the findings will be credible and the findings will be actionable. So will people actually be using the evidence that we create, and will be using the evidence and will be acting on the evidence that's created? So we're going to jump into the discussions. I'll hand it back to Pierre on using Menti, and then we'll jump into the discussion on challenges.
All right, so it's only a few of you here in the room, but if you're here, it's probably because you are believing in the power of RCTs, or that you're maybe also somewhat critical about RCTs. You think it is difficult to implement RCTs, especially in humanitarian settings. And if so, we'd like to hear from you in both cases. Right now, we'll tap into your collective intelligence and experiences with dealing and using RCTs in your context, in your organizations. And so all of you should be somehow connected with your phone, with your laptop. You can actually scan this QR code, and you'll get direct access to a Menti that will prompt a question for you. You can also connect on your laptop menti.com and use this code, which is 89825632. And for the first question, which is kind of open source, you can come up with a description of any given constraint and difficulty, challenge you faced in, I would say, dealing with RCTs, engaging with RCTs, designing RCTs, implementing RCTs in the field. We'd really appreciate hearing from you. We'd like to gather the kind of the key consensual challenges that are out there. So yeah, please do so, and we'll debrief right after. I would want to hear from you in the room a bit more if someone want to exemplify some of those. I think there is a certain consensus. I'm turning also to our esteemed panel for their presentation after, if they can somewhat factor this in. We see a consensus around essentially the ethical concerns, a question on the fact of using a pure control group and what it implies in this context. Challenges also on the project timelines and project cycles that are often way too short or not adapted to actually implement an RCT, right? So those are some of the highlights. Funding mismatch between funding an RCT and funding projects, if not just on the how short are the timelines, but also just the mismatch between funding those two different components. So yeah, would anyone in the room give us a bit more flesh, substance, an example of challenges related to the ethics of RCTs in this field? I think we've seen this and heard this a lot. Using a pure control group, the ethical challenge of not serving a group with any assistance. Yes.
I'd say if it's life-saving assistance, it's not a challenge, it's a prohibition. You just can't do it. I think that the other things that we need to look at are the vulnerability of the groups that we're working with, even if it's not life-saving assistance. If you're working with an extremely traumatized group of displaced people, is this a group that you should ethically be working with? And the other thing I think that we should be asking ourselves are we systematically looking at a conflict impact assessment, not just an ethics assessment, but are we looking at how doing randomization and not providing to some people or communities could actually play into the conflict dynamics of the situation. So there are genuine no-go areas and genuine constraints. Difference in difference testing or staggered testing models are much more acceptable. The gold standard that I've seen is from Medicine Sans Frontières, where if they really need to do something in the medical field that is pretty close to a randomized control trial, they think up the scenario, design it, and do all of the ethical clearance and testing before something happens. And they have it kind of ready to go with all of the considerations and wait for that next Ebola outbreak, and then they'll look at implementing it. And I think if that's the only way I've seen that you could really go into those more contentious spaces is with that incredibly rigorous approach, and only in an exclusively medical field where you just have to do the drug testing or the treatment testing.
It feels like there are a lot of judgment calls that are done on a daily basis by program manager when it comes to who they assist and who they don't. The people in need in a country like Sudan at the moment and the displaced populations of Sudan, I would hope that UN agencies, organizations, humanitarian organizations can actually help everyone. So there is indeed this prohibition of not helping some of the groups, but it seems at the moment just like impossible. The issue is too big, the problem is too big.
If it's life-saving aid, the
yeah.
priority has to go to the most vulnerable.
Exactly. No.
Not to a randomized.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I think the life-saving criteria is something we can all agree on. Absolutely. So we'll get to that, hopefully with some technical aspects on how to try and mitigate some of this challenge. And yeah, let's keep ourselves accountable by the end of the session, see if we have somehow managed to also get to a certain understanding and agreement of some of the ways to mitigate these risks. Anyone want to share on maybe the funding and the project implementation timelines and how that's quite a challenge to deal with? Yeah.
So I worked in Sudan, since you brought up the example, in Darfur before the war started. So first on project implementation is that in such a conflict-affected area, there are incentives for both program implementation staff, both local and like Khartoum-based or international staff, to withhold program implementation information from impact evaluators, because they know things are going to change as the program goes along. This can, from what we saw was, this can vary from, say, which villages they are going to implement in to what exact activities they are going to do. So that's one thing. The second is, there are these huge, usually now in humanitarian sector, there are these huge programs with like 4-6 UN agencies, none of which are really talking to each other and working in a silo. So in such an instance, it's hard to know who is doing what, and again, like, people are moving all the time, right? So how do you randomize in an instance where, like 3 months into the program, a village that was part of the control group has disbanded and moved somewhere else? So those were some questions.
No, thanks for sharing. And yeah, living in a world which is also unfortunately full of very protracted crises and all of those situations that tend to last. Hopefully we find a bit of a middle ground where we see opportunities to actually have our cities in this type of context. We have the next Menti question, where I think Sarah in the background managed to kind of pull out the main risks that you mapped, and we'd like you to map them or to rank them from 1 to 5, I believe, with the opportunity to, here are the top challenges. You can now rank them. You can rank only the first one and stop there, or you can actually rank them from 1 to 5, 1 to 6. We'll give you a minute for that. And in order to move on and to make sure we get to hear first from Sarah, my colleague, and then from our esteemed panel, I think I'll leave you with these top 3 challenges, starting with, I think it moved, but with the quick rollout of programs in this kind of settings. So basically the short project timelines. Okay, each time I turn my head, number 1 option has changed. So now it's ethics, and I think the first 3 haven't moved so much. So in whatever order, ethics, short project timelines, and political feasibility, as in how to even get this done, political feasibility within a certain context and country, but also within an organization, a lot of pushback on this kind of approaches. I will leave you with this. I will leave also our panelists with these thoughts. They'll try and address some of them. And first, up and next is Sarah to share some insight from our experience at JPAL dealing with these challenges.
Thank you. So I think we're back on the slides now, and I think we're going to sit in a bit of this uncomfortableness of having the challenges aired out and not yet having the solutions, but we're hopefully going to get there. And you can also keep us accountable. There will be a Q&A at the end where we'll be able to discuss with the panelists about some of these challenges and the solutions that they might propose. But let's get started. So there are various challenges at different stages and different project stages. So deciding whether or not to evaluate and deciding how to do that, preparing for research implementation or evaluation implementation, and also the actual implementation itself. But these challenges are perhaps not only for randomized evaluation. These challenges can be quite similar for other research in challenging contexts or in fragile contexts. So I think we should put this into context that we can pull from solutions that are not only specific for randomized evaluations. So JPAL has put together this learning agenda for randomized impact evaluations in humanitarian action, and I'm going to be pulling from discussions with 30 different organizations in the humanitarian context and really their expertise and their insights. So don't want to claim them as our own, but we had really the opportunity to discuss with many different humanitarian practitioners and researchers in this space. There is a QR code here if we're really using the QR codes today, but if you want to scan that for our learning agenda. And the goal of the learning agenda is really to document the learning goals of humanitarian practitioners and also documenting essentially the operational and conceptual challenges of randomized evaluations and the proposed solutions to these evaluations. And we really went through to determine the responsible randomization designs for humanitarian settings and listing these. And that part is what I'll dig into today, and I'll leave the challenges and how to overcome these challenges a little bit to the panelists to speak about later. But the designs are really aimed to adapt to the challenges of a specific context. So to start with this, essentially we're going to be discussing, how do you choose different randomization processes and different randomization options. And starting here first with the basic lottery. So this might be the randomization design that you've heard a lot about, where you have essentially the treatment group that gains access to the program and the control group that does not receive the program. And so while not everyone receives the program, everyone has essentially an equal probability of receiving the program. And this can be seen as often a fair way to allocate if there is everyone in the sample or everyone who is going to be randomly assigned who have equal need for the program. So I'm showing an example now, and this is an example of refugees integration into the labor market in Uganda. And essentially the aim of the program was to promote economic integration of refugees and the perception and change and shift the perception of local businesses that employ these refugees. And so the selection into the program was essentially selected by community leaders and village leaders and then randomized for inclusion into either a control group or either a treatment group. And so the issue that they faced is that the budget was not sufficient to offer to everyone that could have received the program. And so the way that they solved for that was randomizing. And so selecting beneficiaries through a basic lottery essentially allowed that all eligible individuals had an equal opportunity of being chosen. So to put some numbers to it and to really give an example, essentially here we see that there was 535 individuals and that were equally or randomized into treatment and control. 325 received the treatment because that's how many were able to be provided for, and what they received essentially was certification of skills and an internship program. And they saw that there was quite positive effects of this program. But to focus on the design specifically, so the basic lottery was essentially most appropriate because the demand for the program exceeded the number of people that would be available and the spots available. I think another advantage of this design option is that it's very easily understandable. It's essentially putting all the names into a hat and picking into treatment and control. And this can be one of the more fair or transparent methods of allocation. And some of the limitations to that is that the group that does not receive the program, so the control group, might not cooperate with the evaluation. And that's a challenge that comes with basic lottery, is that you might kind of lose out on your control group. Now we're going to be discussing other design options and comparing them back to the basic lottery option. So I think we heard some of the challenges of having a control group that does not receive the program. And this phase-in design is kind of a direct reaction to that. So the phase-in design is the treatment group gains access to the program, and the control group essentially gains access to the program, but only at a later time. And oftentimes this is taking advantage of some of the phasing in that happens usually when we roll out different programs. And so it's taking advantage of that program specification. So it's very useful when there are resources for all participants, but there's not the capacity to implement or serve all the people at once. And so this is quite common and something that we see often, and so it's possible to take advantage of this in randomization. So going into a little bit of an example of this. So here we see in year 1, we have group A, B, and C that we have here. Group A is receiving the treatment, and group B and C is the control group. In year 2, we see that group A and B now receive the treatment, and group C remains to be the control group. And now all 3 receive the treatment, and the end of the evaluation would be in that year, in year 3. And so over the course of 3 years, we have people that are receiving the program, but we're also taking advantage and learning about what the impact of the program is. So I'm going to show an example that actually Hila will speak about in detail later, so I won't give too many details. But an example of this that we've seen is the digital delivery of humanitarian aid to improve both food security of women in Afghanistan, but also looking at impacts of mental health and understanding some of the more social impact. So in the context of Afghanistan's economic collapse after the Taliban and increasing marginalization of women particularly. And so this is a direct aid program where people were or women specifically were provided about $45 US over 2 months and for every 2 weeks. So what this looked like was a randomization in 2 phases. So this is a phase-in design. So they were provided the first group, so about 1,200 households were provided direct aid in the first phase. And then afterwards, in the second phase, the rest, so about 1,200 households, were provided the second phase. And so this actually happened 2 to 3 months after. This is an example of a very nimble randomization and where the control group wasn't a control group for that long. And we were able to really gain insights quickly about the impacts and about the direct impacts of the program. So this was most appropriate in terms of design because it wasn't possible to exclude anyone from receiving the program, and so it was necessary to provide, but perhaps there were other implementation challenges to providing to everyone all at once. So some of the advantage of this was that in the long run, everyone does receive the program, but the limitations of this is that once you provide the intervention or the program to your control group, they become essentially treated. And so they have the program and you can no longer understand the impacts and you can no longer compare the 2 groups. So we'll be able to hear about this more later and we can kind of fuel some questions for the Q&A as well. So I'll quickly speak about randomization in the bubble. And so what randomization looks like, randomization in the bubble, essentially is a design that's used when you are selecting program participants based on a score. So this might be a vulnerability threshold, or this might be a different type of score that you provide to an individual in kind of assessing whether or not they fall within the scope of who should be targeted. And so the lottery is conducted only for those who are slightly above or slightly below this threshold. And this essentially allows us to not necessarily have a group of people who don't receive the program, and so we exclude those who are in extremely high need, and we provide them with the program. And so when it's very useful when it's impossible to withhold the program. And so, this is very useful when having a control group is just simply not an option. We see this in moments of high need or high vulnerability, and we would only randomize with candidates that are near this threshold, or this threshold that we create. So I'm going to go over here, but maybe I'll point over there, but you see this old cutoff, actually, perfect, I'll use this. So you see this old cutoff, that this was everything, to the left of this was the original kind of threshold, so the eligibility criteria. Everyone to the left is not in our randomization, they're not included in that. And perhaps we've increased the cutoff to really understand what the impact is when we increase a cutoff. And that's our new study sample. And those that are above the cutoff are not eligible either, because there's a reason that we target the sample to this specific set of people. So we essentially don't include those that are above it. But what this can tell us is that we can really have a clear understanding of what happens when we create this new cutoff. So what happens when we kind of get a new understanding of targeting. But we also can understand essentially if those people that are just above the cutoff are very similar in many ways to those that don't receive it. We can also understand potentially the impacts on the general sample. A little bit more complicated, we can get into the details of that as well. So essentially the advantage of this is that it allows to determine the impact of expanding the eligibility cutoff. That's something that we can learn through that, so understanding more about targeting. And I think the limitation of this is that it does limit external validity. So moving swiftly through this, because I want to make sure that we have time for the speakers, but I want to share essentially another way of thinking about design. So there's also multiple treatment design is how we call it, and so it's being able to compare essentially various interventions towards each other, and also understanding the complementarity of different interventions. So through multiple treatment designs, we can have an understanding of which intervention has the greatest impact by comparing interventions against each other. And we can understand which is the most effective component of a program. And also the ideal intensity of the treatment. So it's quite useful when we want to compare programs against each other, or also understand complementarities of programs. And so what this could look like is that you have study A here that essentially is looking at testing, first we have study A, which is our typical treatment and control. And we see study B here, which is understanding group treatment 1 compared to a different intervention. So one intervention compared to another, and also comparing that to the control group. And then we have example C, where we're also looking at A/B testing. So not having the control group at all, and seeing if we can compare one intervention to the other. And that, the kind of negative sides of that is that we can't understand the overall impact because we don't have a control group to compare it to, but we can understand the relative impact, which is actually quite positive when we're making kind of decisions on how we're, choosing program components. So I will skip this example, although happy to dive into that later if we need to, but there is a really great example of a cash grant in Tunisia that's looking at comparing cash and training, and comparing cash and joint training with partners. And we're able to have really interesting findings through this that were not necessarily clear from the onset. And I think I've covered this, and maybe to leave you just with this, with the randomization trade-offs. So there are specific contexts and specific challenges that you would use designs to overcome. And no design is a perfect one, and it really is context dependent, and none of these decisions are made without context in mind, and without the challenges that you're aiming to overcome in mind. And so with that, I think we'll pass it on to our first speaker, who'll kind of aim to talk about some of the challenges and really give you contextual details about that, but I'll hand it off to Pierre first.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And in case of questions, and I'm sure they might be in the room, we'll take them after we hear from our panelists. So no big transition, because I think the value is really in hearing from our panelists. First is Felipe Dunch from WFP.
Do we have a clicker? How does this work? Green? Okay. Back as well? Red? Okay, thanks for being here. It's great that there's not so many people here, so I have an unobstructed view of the Brooklyn skyline, so that's great. I'm Felipe from the World Food Programme's Impact Evaluation Unit, which is part of the Office of Evaluation. We've been a unit for about 3 years, so quite new, but are already the largest unit in our office, so we're quite proud of that. I coordinate 2 work streams, one on cash transfers and gender, and one which is what we call the humanitarian work stream, which is generously supported by USAID's Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance. So thanks a lot for that. And yeah, we've been working with BHA for about 4 years on this type of work. at the very beginning, we commissioned a literature review on how many impact evaluations are there actually on transfers, so humanitarian transfers. What do we know about transfers? And we only found 20 studies ever done that are either impact evaluations, randomized trials, or quasi-experimental studies on the topic. So it's quite small number, which gave us a good mandate to do more of this. We're at WFP, the world's largest humanitarian organization, working in all countries around the world, but know relatively little about what works best. Not so much whether we should assist people when they're in need. That's sort of speaks to what you said earlier. I think that's pretty clear. If people are struggling, if people are in need of assistance, we should help them. And that's been proven many times. I think Dean spoke to this a bit earlier also, right? We don't need another study on should we help people or not, right? That's clear. What's open is how do we help them best, especially thinking about cost effectiveness and making sort of our dollars go as far as they can. That's a really important question. So we embarked on this journey to do more of humanitarian impact evaluations despite all the difficulties. And currently I work on 7 ongoing ones in Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, DRC, Lebanon, Peru. I'm sure I forgot a couple, but yeah, we're really trying to work with our country offices to embed learning into their operations. All of these studies don't have a pure control group, so we always sort of compare different tweaks of the programming to see if those small tweaks, often cost-neutral tweaks, can lead to significant improvements. So, oh, that's still the old slide here. Okay. So today, just to give you a quick taste, and we can also, during the Q&A session, speak about other projects that we do. So I just wanted to briefly mention our Nepal project, which is an anticipatory action project. So basically, anticipatory action, for those that don't know, is basically sort of a movement that's gaining steam to provide humanitarian assistance in advance of a climatic shock. So that could be either flood or a drought. Some even want to use it for conflict. I don't know, we might get there at some point. So the premise is that rather than waiting for a shock to happen, we provide people with assistance prior to the shock based on weather forecasts and certain triggers, right? And the anticipatory action can be just food or cash assistance, but it also often comes with early messaging and some other packages. So that the term can include many different forms of assistance. We solely focused on the cash assistance in Nepal. So try to be quick here. So the question is, do early cash transfers help households cope with the impacts of the weather shock when compared to sort of the more standard later transfers that are being sent after the shock has happened and the damage has been assessed? So the question is then, you might ask, why don't we just help people as early as we can? It's a valid question, and we thought about this a lot too, but there is some downsides of acting too early, which is basically, if we base this assistance on the triggers, we don't know if the flood is actually happening, right? So you might help a lot of people with transfers or other types of assistance, and then let's say the flood is not happening or is not as severe as you thought, or you thought the flood is over here, but it's actually over there, but you spend all your money over here and you have nothing for the people over there. So, and then so I just mentioned the first 2 points here. The third point is also important. We don't know if markets keep functioning. So if you send cash to a location where everything is broken down, that might not be the best time for cash assistance, right? People might not be able to use cash in that moment. So there's a trade-off essentially between speed and precision. So assisting too early can also have its downsides. And I don't want to speak too much about results because actually my colleague, so to say, Paul, spoke about these findings in an earlier session today on the climate session. So some of you might have seen that. But more about the process. I'm also happy to engage on this later. So basically we had we worked with the country office, and we had like 2 river basins, and we had data from people that would be beneficiaries basically, but we never knew who would actually be sort of triggered if the trigger is activated, who would actually become an actual beneficiary. So we were basically during the monsoon season in daily contact with the country office, sort of waiting for these triggers to happen if they would happen, and then one day they did happen, and we basically sort of randomized on the spot the households that would sort of get the early transfer and the households that would get the later transfer. This was a small group of the overall group that received the early assistance. So most people received the early assistance, and a small group received the later assistance a couple of weeks after the shock, basically. Just checking if I'm missing something. So this was a $115 transfer, unconditional transfer. It happened, so they were ready to respond to 26,000 people and eventually responded to 12,500 people. Of the 12,500, we had sort of 3,000 households in this randomized control trial. So we did no baseline data collection. We just relied on the targeting data that they collected, which was not sort of as large as we would have liked for an impact evaluation, but given that we didn't know which people would actually be part of the assistance, we couldn't interview 26,000 people just to have a baseline, so we just worked with what was available. And then we basically randomized 70 villages in the early arm and 70 villages in the late arm. And I have to back up a little bit. We planned this same study in 3 countries and waited for 2 years. We were ready to act in Nepal, in Bangladesh, and the Philippines. And we got ethical clearance in advance, listing all the countries. We designed and programmed the survey in the different languages, adapted to the context. The Philippines has some more typhoon profile, Bangladesh, Nepal has the flooding issues. We got the ethical clearance, we had the programs ready, the survey ready programmed, we had the contact with the survey companies, so they had the terms of reference, they knew the time frame when we would need them, and we could be activated in a matter of a couple of weeks. So the support from BHA really helped us to build this at scale, right? Because we with an impact evaluation like this, you cannot say we have 1 year, we'll do it here, and we have the evidence we need. So we needed sort of the multiple countries, we needed that flexibility, and also the ability to sort of wait a couple of years. So this triggered in 2022, and then this year Bangladesh triggered as well. So now we have 2 studies with the exact same design. Slight differences, obviously, because countries are different. The transfer value is a bit different, but this will really move the needle, we think, on anticipatory action, no? Because this is, if not the first, probably the second randomized controlled trial on anticipatory action. So, and if we have 2, right, from starting something new and come up with 2 randomized trials, that can really sort of shape the discourse. So we're quite sort of proud of again, not so much only about the results, but also the mechanics of setting this up. And this can be an example of how this can be done, not just for floods and droughts, but also for other types of programs, right? Just to briefly look at what then happened. So here you see the white bars are 3 data collection rounds, basically. So we collect, this does not include the targeting baseline data, just our own surveys. Sort of the y-axis is the flood peak. The transfers actually went out a little bit later than we would have liked, so they didn't come like the day before the flood peak, but rather like a day or 2 after. Still much faster than anything WFP would ever do. And then we collected data 3 weeks later, which was quite a hectic period for us, no? Because we overnight randomized, checked the data, called the survey company, had a training, and all that happened in a matter of weeks, which usually takes months. So, and then you see the blue, I think it's hard to see here, but the non-white bars are basically the transfers that went out to the early group and the transfers that went out to the later group. Just really quickly on the results, because some of you might have seen this before. So we do see sort of modest impacts on food security, but given that this is pretty cost neutral, at least at the local scale, there is obviously cost for setting up the forecasting systems. But once you have those in place, it's quite it's cost neutral, I would say. So like a 5% increase of food security. But then once the second group receives their transfer, that kind of levels off, which is not unexpected, right? Animal meat consumption remains persistently higher for the anticipatory action group, which was quite interesting. So you basically, one main finding is you buy yourself more weeks of higher food security through acting early at potentially no additional costs. There's obviously more to this story, but that's sort of the big high-level headline here. Then we also see significant improvements on measures of mental health, depression and anxiety at the first data collection round, which also levels off after the second group received their transfer. And then also a reduction in negative coping strategies. So, quite interesting findings. We hope to publish this report within the next month or so. So, hope you all take a look. And then we'll have the Bangladesh findings too, and then we'll try to do a combined report, pooling the results together, and we'll also have that out. I think that's it. We're planning more work of this type. Also going to Mozambique for droughts, and very similar to sort of the anticipatory action work is the sort of crop insurance, microinsurance work is very related. So we also try to do a bit more work on that in the future. So I'll stop there. Happy to chat more about sort of the how to do this during the Q&A session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Felipe. Yeah, absolutely brilliant, innovative steps that have been put in place by WFP in really having all these further steps and how to adapt basically and to really prepare for our cities. I think that's really something we can all reflect on, and with the many partners we have in the field, see how that's a great example that speaks to reducing the issue of timelines, pressure on funding on one part, and preparing for our cities. So thanks a lot, Felipe. Next will be Miguel from UNICEF speaking to us about the project aspect in Yemen. Over to you.
Hello. So I'll be telling you about aspect and using Yemen as an example of what we're doing. Happy anticipated guy we have here. So as a design clinic, I have no results, but I have a lot of design things for Yemen because we were just there with Sarah, or in Jordan with Sarah, planning this evaluation. So what is aspect? Aspect is adaptive social protection evidence for child outcomes. So it's a project headed by the evaluation office with funding from BIMZ, the German corporation, and it's a collaborative project. So it has these different parts: monitoring, evaluation, research, and data analysis, and how do they go together. So one of the big parts that it has is that it has a program social group, so that way we understand what are the different programs on social policy that they are, because it's for adaptive social protection. So kind of what is the future? How do we see social protection being more adaptive, more responsive to the climate changes, to the changing environment that we can expect, both on climate, on conflict, and in economics. in the economy. We also have the PAM, the Division of Data Analytics, in Innocenti Global Office of Research and Planning, and Foresight, not planning, and Foresight. So together, kind of bringing these different parts of UNICEF to collaborate to come up with a portfolio that we can learn different parts of adaptive social protection. So one of the slices of that is the impact evaluation part. That's going to put this research and evaluation diagonal, putting it together. And that one is led by the evaluation office and Innocenti research. The monitoring part, the PAM, that is kind of finding out new indicators that are specifically for social protection in child center. That can be maybe included in the mix or included in the impact evaluation questionnaires that we're going to use. And then there's another research part that is more in general research, and not maybe the research of impact evaluation, that is around public financing, the timing that might have, MIS systems and systems of governance, and like kind of putting all of that together to better understand the adaptive social protection part. So I'm gonna talk about the impact evaluation part. So the impact evaluation part, we use, maybe you have heard around the Impact Catalyst Fund as a tool to kind of prop up demand, to see where the demand is. There's a lot of things happening in UNICEF. So there was a call on adaptive social protection, so that way the different country offices can be like, I have a program that I think is interesting and that I always say, show off. You can show off your program with the evaluation. That it's not always that a bad thing, or it's not always saying like, oh, this is not working. Part of the thing is this is not working, but also it's going to be, this worked very well. Maybe some of the things that we didn't expect in direct effect, we can find it out in the impact evaluation also there. So having that kind of open and flexible view. So for the adaptive social protection, we had 14 countries apply 15 applications, and we rigorously kind of had a panel from different groups reviewing the programs, the feasibility of an impact evaluation. And I'm saying here impact evaluation because we didn't limit ourselves to just RCT. I'm gonna talk about the RCTs, but we start with the RCT, but are open to other methodologies because we know the difficulty, especially in the fragile settings, right? A lot of these things we might know how to do it in development settings and kind of regular settings, and they're difficult to do. So when you go into a fragile setting, we need some flexibility there because we need to generate, maybe it's probably going to be very different in those settings, and if it's a protracted crisis or not, than if it's just a development kind of setting. So 6 countries were selected: Kenya, Somalia, Mozambique, Pakistan, Tajikistan, and Yemen. And all of them have their adaptive social protection, but have different parts. There's a lot of nutrition work. We have one with a paramedic insurance. There's anticipatory parts that we're doing kind of in Kenya and Somalia. And I'm going to focus here on the kind of brainstorming design of the Yemen one. So the context of Yemen, we have a protracted crisis, right? Since late 2014, there's active conflict, infrastructure destruction. It's difficult to access places. From the local population, there's limited public services, a lot of dire circumstances. So what are we going to do? So one of the things is like, what is the social protection system in Yemen in this kind of situation? So we need to find, instead of saying like, oh, it has to be through this institution and it has to be done, it's like, no, let's ask what is actually being done in the field. So here we went and found out, right, the proposal was in a humanitarian cash transfer, unconditional cash transfer that is very, very big in the amount of people that it covers, and these adaptive features that adaptive social protection. So kind of how is this program different? What are we going to learn new? We know that giving money to people works. So like what we want to learn is how can we do better. And like as Tim was saying, not everything needs to get evaluated, not everything needs to get an evaluation, not everything needs an impact evaluation. So kind of being selective of what we're doing, so that way we put the resources to get a good quality evidence that then we can use later on, leverage later on. So for the cash transfer, I have here kind of some challenges and solutions. Randomizing the eligible population. So I think that came out, right? We cannot always randomize it because this is a categorical program. If you have this criteria, how are you going to tell people that it's like, that you tell them what the eligibility criteria, they go and tell you this is, I am eligible, and you're like, no, because the lottery said no. You cannot do that. So having kind of the different tools, and Sarah was helping us there, what other methods can we have when we cannot just do a randomization via the community or at the individual level? So here the solution is this kind of regression discontinuity, and it's like related to the bubble that Sarah was talking. So we all have limited resources. There's so many people that we're gonna be able to cover. So by listening to the program colleagues in the CO, we learned that there's going to be a registration of people, and there's going to be a list that's going to be bigger than what we can actually serve. The list is going to be prioritized, but if we have a limited budget, there's so far that the list is going to go. We only have money to include 500,000 people. So if you have 1 million in your list, the ones that are more vulnerable are going to be on the top, and you're going to go until the money is done, right? So using that part of the design, that's how it was planned, that's how the money was collected, let's say, we can use that to this kind of regression discontinuity and compare the people that are right on top with the people that are right on the bottom. And it's a part of the evaluation of seeing how can we adapt that method to the situation there. So it's like, let's say, sampling enough people at the bottom and at the top, but not so much at the tails, because those people are going to be very different. And that way, the people that are on the line, we don't say that you cannot touch them, let's say as a pure control, because we know that the people that are on the line, things happen in the field. Some people are going to get treated, some people are not. We're going to miss some of them. But we can adjust for that statistically later. But that allows us to have a more flexible and strong methodology for what we expect to happen in the field, without putting a lot of dots, periods, and commas on what the implementers can do. So data collection challenges. So part of the accessibility here, an extra difficulty in Yemen is that there's on the content and on the people that you can ask questions, there's a lot of limitations from the different authorities. So how do we go about going through that? So the solution that we found here is leveraging existing processes and relationships that they are. There's already a monitoring system, let's say, in data collection, post-distribution. How can we modify here and there so that way we can include an impact evaluation kind of data requirements there? Can we convince them to have a group that is not being treated? They're on the list, so the wait list group, we can tell the authorities, can we go and ask questions to the people that are on the wait list, and they're really on a wait list, right? If we find more money, we have a list that is already ordered. From there that we're gonna pick. So we can be like very honest on what we're doing and use the parameters that are given to us to put some order and get some evidence that then we can later say, this $1 that I put here did this for food security, did this for access to services. So using those systems. The limited depth of the instrument, things change a lot and very fast in humanitarian settings. So having a data collection strategy that is not just a baseline and endline, it seems to be really important here. So we can catch things in the middle. That is expensive. One of the solutions that we came up here is that leveraging again the system and the way that the payments go out to have those data collection systems, data collection efforts more periodically and not have them as big as we would do a baseline and an end line. So in the end, we're going to have a little more noise in between, but we're going to have a trajectory of how we're doing and an opportunity in those middle parts to do some tweaks because we are in this humanitarian setting. My last two. So potential restriction on sharing evaluation results. This happens not just in humanitarian settings, but in everything that we do. Can we say that we didn't find anything? Part of the thing of doing the evaluation is you have to be open to finding things that you don't like. And it's just kind of building the culture and bringing people from the beginning, from the design. The program hasn't started, and we have the evaluation, the program team, and the government, the authorities, kind of sitting at the same table and putting everybody on the same page why we're doing what we're doing. So that way, that in the end, it doesn't feel that it's like, it's not to castigate anybody that the results are coming. The numbers are gonna be the numbers, but setting up expectations of what can come out. So that way, there's no surprises later on. And then the setting up our expectations, I think it's really, really important. There's limitations of the treatment that we do. If you give $1,000, it's different than if you do $10, even if you do it weekly. So setting up those expectations of not expecting miracles for what we're doing and say like, this is the size of the treatment that we're doing, and these are the kind of effects that we can expect. Finally, we don't need to do, one of the things here that brings our flexibility is that you can bring different methodologies into the same evaluation. There's the big evaluation program, let's say, that has qualitative, etc. And then the slice of impact evaluation, we're always promoting the mixed methods to triangulate and contextualize the quantitative findings. But even in the quantitative part, we can use the randomization, the listing that I did for the regression discontinuity. Then within that group, we are interested in anticipatory versus post-shock. So we do an A/B testing with the group that we're still using. Another part that in Yemen wanted was the plus part. But the plus part, you cannot go to everywhere at the same time. So we did, in each of the A and B, we do a phase-in. That's how they were gonna do. Instead of doing it without order, we said like, let's make a plan and commit to the plan on how the cash plus is gonna be expanded, so that way then we can use it in the comparisons for the evaluation. And that way everybody kind of gets what they want. In the sense we get the overall effect, we get innovations of the adaptive evaluation, and also the cash plus effects in particular, we can use it with the same sample, just sitting early enough so that way we can think what kind of edges we can compare and can provide evidence later on. Let me leave it there, and we can talk more after and during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Miguel. Thank you so much. I invite now Hela from Uplift Afghanistan.
Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. So I feel like there's not a lot of time left for Afghanistan, unfortunately, but I think I'm timing myself now, and I will just stop after 5 minutes, no matter where I am. Is that no? Do we have more time? 7 to 8 minutes. Okay, good. Yes. Okay, perfect. Well, thank you for having us. I mean, everybody at JPAL, of course, and UNICEF and WFP. We're, I think, among the smaller ones here. And I think it's, it's just a pleasure to exchange with you and give us our perspective also from Afghanistan. I don't want to talk much about our organization at this point, because I think yesterday you heard a little bit about it already, and I think we can, talk later also more, who we are, what we do. In your cases, often it's clear already, what does WFP do, what does UNICEF do, but in our case, I think, we could talk some more. I'm here now. We were asked to speak about our RCTs in Afghanistan, and we have done several ones actually by now, but here I'm going to be talking about actually our first RCT. So Uplift was, I'm going to say only this, it was created in the wake of the humanitarian crisis after the collapse of the Afghan Republic. And so, you know, as so many, you know, started with a whole evacuation effort and then went into, you know, the bigger humanitarian, but then also, as some would say, as a humanitarian plus or development programs. And we're, you know, fully Afghan women founded and led organization that is based in the US and spread all over the world, and of course with a local presence. Our first RCT was also planned not so long after the fall of the Republic at the beginning of 2022. And as I think really everybody in the room knows, there was an incredibly difficult time. I mean, the banking system collapsed. Part of the members of the Taliban group had OFAC sanctions on them, and then became part of the government, and there with the government was partly sanctioned. And so it was getting incredibly difficult to get, sorry, I'm not even moving here, to get aid into the country. And so we've heard a lot about that cash. There's a lot of evidence on cash assistance already, right? I think that's being said a lot. This approach here was to provide direct digital aid to women without a cash out option. So like really purely digital aid in that new context that was so new to all of us and so uncertain. The research questions were: can extremely poor, tech illiterate, vulnerable women actually make use of direct aid? Do these direct transfers improve food security and well-being? Are these transfers diverted? Of course, there was this big risk of aid diversion, and there still is. And how much does it actually cost to deliver aid? The theory of change was, if successful, this model could really provide recipients with more autonomy and also increase transparency as compared to other aid allocations. As I mean, people who were involved in Afghanistan might remember that at the very beginning of this new kind of reality in the country, I mean, there was just planes of cash coming into the country, held in vault, and then delivered across the country, which obviously did not make sense. And then the second part here, payments can be sent directly to beneficiaries who can then exchange these funds directly with shops that are participating basically in the program. Can I go back as well? Okay, so just a few, it's the project, $75,000 was the budget of the project. Sarah mentioned I was around 2,500 beneficiaries, and in the urban areas of Kabul, Herat, and Mazar-i Sharif. So we worked together with quite amazing researchers, academics from the London School of Economics, Washington University in St. Louis, and University of Texas in Austin. And so Sarah mentioned the overall approach was to give that aid money in digital aid to the women in every 2 weeks over the course of 2 months, and there was $45 equivalent to that each, through a local app that is called Hisab Pay app. It's a local Afghan app that was already existent since 2016. And had some kind of advantages over other similar platforms. For example, it allowed for future phones, which was really important, had kind of alternative options that could be used. For example, if people did not have a smartphone, however, there was a QR code that could just work perfectly the same way as the actual app usage. Sarah mentioned we divided the beneficiaries into early and late treatment groups, so nobody did not receive, so everybody received aid ultimately. I think important to know also here, I don't know if I'm actually talking about this later on, but so the women did not know in which group they were, right? So they were randomly assigned to the group, and would also only hear a couple of days before receiving the actual funds in which group they were. Okay, I'm already 5 minutes, but so So I think important to say is that, well, we always work. I mean, we cannot work without our local partners, of course. I mean, these are very experienced grassroots organizations, and partly also actually former officials from the big national development programs in the country that kind of decided not to work with the current government and kind of formed, their own NGO, but took with them the contacts, the networks, the access to local mechanisms, local structures that we're still working with. And so we did not do a lottery selecting the beneficiaries. We actually worked with a already established poverty analysis. It's called the well-being analysis that puts the people into 4 different categories. And we worked with the extreme poor and the poor. I think a really important part of this whole project was, I mean, we took a lot of time. Everything took longer than planned. And we really, the onboarding of the beneficiaries into the program really was scripted as it had to be. It had to be translated into different languages. Then that had to be, again, double-checked in order to make sure that it's all sensitive, it's all responsible, it's all understandable. And so we actually had like different little pilots within the pilot. So we had like, I think 5 rounds of small pilots of the onboarding exercise until we actually refined it and we're actually felt ready to scale within the program. Thinking, I mean, lessons learned, we could see, and I really actually would love for you guys, whoever wants to, please give me your card. I'll be happy to send you the paper, the full paper, and also the little summary. I think it's really interesting and really worthwhile. It basically confirmed that this type of aid did support or did address humanitarian needs. So. We could confirm that the beneficiaries were actually skipped fewer meals and actually were less reliant on bread and tea meals. Local authorities, very important, did not try to steal, divert the money. It's much more difficult. Cash obviously is easy to be stolen, but it's difficult if it's on your phone, you have a QR code, and it's connected to your identity card. So that was something really I think interesting to see. And we also saw that basically almost all women made use of the assistance within 8 weeks of receiving it. So within the 8 weeks, they went and went shopping with their aid money. Okay, very interesting. We did a cost of delivery analysis. I think somebody from the IRC is going to be talking about this tomorrow. We would love to do this more. I think it was so interesting to really know that you're able to deliver so lean. Many of us, as we always do, we also kind of donate our time. So I don't know, depending on where you work, how that would look like. But in that case, taking out even like our input, $1 of assistance would only cost 1.4 cents in delivery, which literally is nothing. So I think that's really. That was very positive to see. Not everything was positive. A lot of challenges. They wouldn't fit on one slide. These are just a few. And I'll just let you read if you want. Maybe I'll just pick quickly 2 or so. Pierre, if I'm still good. Yeah? So I would just say, for example, availability of smartphones was limited in the target population. Generally, Afghanistan has a relatively high penetration, like cellular penetration, but then of course within this group, it's much, much less, right? So you could also be using that feature if somebody in the household had a phone. However, even if single female households or other situations, we were able to provide these the QR codes, and they could be used the same way as the smartphones, and also feature phones could have been used. Then ensuring higher response rates and participant engagement can be very difficult, for sure. We scripted everything. It was, really carefully planned, as said, lots of pilots before actually going into the scale-up. And so we did incentivize the surveys as well. So they were connected to small payments that could also be used for essential goods. And so we explained that, we appreciate their participation, but they didn't have to. I feel like I just stop here, so we'll have a few more minutes. Yeah? Okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hela. Yeah, I think that's the downside of being squeezed right after there is no coffee break for us to eat up from, so we'll have to leave the spot to the next session. I think there is here a joint impact evaluation session. In the other room is the focus on Latin America. I've been asked to make that announcement. Let me just have a couple of points before letting you go to the next sessions or grab a coffee or something to drink there in between sessions. Thank you again to all our panelists. I think there was a wealth of knowledge in those experiences. Thank you again. And please, let's have the conversation going. Let's keep discussing challenges and how to overcome them in those contexts. I think the advantages of having such a small group, as such a focus group, was that we know each other. You know where to find us in the next session, tomorrow as well. We at JPAL work hand in hand with IPA on trying to really overcome those challenges in such settings, to actually have randomized evaluations that are meaningful and that provide learnings to our partners. And yeah, again, thanks for our panelists who will be happy to, I'm sure, chat with you at some of the coffee breaks in the coming sessions. Thanks a lot.